Good afternoon to everyone joining us in the room and on Zoom. Very welcome to our 8th ME101 lecture. This is going to be the last lecture in the series, but not the least, because next week we will have the closing session with our executive director, who is going to give a wrap-up for ME101 lectures and discuss the implications to Singapore and the wider Southeast Asia. So stay tuned and join us next Thursday. So last week, we hosted Dr. Hanan Muaibad, who gave us and shed light on the social, economic, and also the cultural and religious transformations in Saudi Arabia, and including the changes in the personal status law that reduce the restrictions on women and limiting the authority of the religious bodies in Saudi Arabia. In today's lecture, we will focus on the religion and political Islam in the Middle East and its impact on the Southeast Asia. We would hope also to learn on how those changes that are taking place in the Middle East will cascade in Southeast Asia and influence the Islamic and cultural practices in this part of the world. So, to discuss that and more, I'm very delighted to be joined today by Dr. Norshal bin Saad, who is a senior fellow at the Yusuf Ishaq Institute, is our neighbor institute. He is the coordinator of Regional Social Cultural Studies Program, as well as Indonesia Studies Program and Malaysia Studies Program. And a little bit of background of Dr. Norshal. He received his PhD in 2015 in International Political and Strategic Studies by the Australian National University. He also received his BA in Political Science and MA in Malay Studies from the National University of Singapore. He was a recipient of the many scholars and awards, including the NUSMA Scholar, Tun Dato Sir Shin Luk Tan, ISAS MA Scholar in 2008, and the MUIS PhD Scholar in 2012. The MOE SSRC awarded him a grant to study the Singapore's Islamic Studies graduates. Dr. Norshal is currently a member of the editorial committee for journal Sojourn. He also sits as a volunteer on numerous advisory boards, including the chairman of Malay Heritage Foundation. His recent book was published only a few days ago, maybe 2 days ago, titled Trending Islam, Cases from Southeast Asia. Before I give the mic to Dr. Norshal, I would like to remind everyone, those in the room, if you have questions, you can note them down and then we can take them. You should wait for the microphone. Those who are online, feel free to post your questions in the chat box. And with that, I give the floor to Dr. Norshal.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Aisha, for the very generous, kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining this session very late today. Maybe I just share my slides before we proceed. So thank you once again to the Middle East Institute for this invitation. It's not the first time I've done this. So immediately when I was asked to deliver this lecture, ME101, which is a very good initiative, I immediately said yes. As mentioned by Professor Aisha earlier, that my research mainly focuses on Southeast Asia, and we are from a neighboring institution just across the road. I look at Southeast Asian Islam very closely, but often when we talk about Southeast Asian Islam, we cannot escape talking about the developments in the Middle East, because Islam is very much closely tied to the Middle East. And as we know, with the evolution changes that's happening in the Middle East, there's always plenty to talk about and how it impacts Southeast Asia. For this particular lecture, I've been asked to share the linkages between the Middle East and Southeast Asian Islam, and I'm very happy to do so. There's of course some particular questions that have been asked that I should be covering in this lecture, but I thought I want to take this opportunity to address mainly two dominant perceptions about this linkage between Middle East, Islam, and Southeast Asia. There is this dominant perception that has colored academia as well as research interests out there. First, the linkage between Southeast Asian Islam and the Middle East centers around the issues of terrorism and radicalism. And I think this has defined very much the scholarship out there, and some form of anxieties as well, particularly developments in the Middle East and how it's impacting Southeast Asian Islam. That's the first concern that we have. Second concern that we normally hear amongst academics, scholars, policymakers is the fear of deculturalization of Southeast Asia, meaning, the commonly used term is that the Malays, particularly in Southeast Asia, dominantly are Muslims, are losing their cultural identity and becoming Arabized. So this whole deculturalization process is always seen as the Arabization of Southeast Asia, or Arabization of the Malay world. So these are normally the two concerns that we have and we hear amongst policymakers and amongst academics circles. So these are the two questions that I wish to address along the way. So just bear that in mind as we approach. So I will address these issues briefly. I understand that this is a 101, and I've written quite a bit about some of these issues. So in areas in which I don't have the time to go in depth, perhaps you may want to read them. And of course, and we can have that engagement. And in this presentation, I will also do my best to share not only the contemporary perspective, but we also need to look at the historical perspectives in order to better understand and also to do justice to this relationship between Middle East and Southeast Asian Islam. So these are the issues, these are objectives of the lecture that I wish to, quite ambitious within the short period of time given for today's lecture. So I wish to articulate the evolution of religion's place in the Arab world. Again, from a cursory view as a Southeast Asianist from afar, we see how developments are happening in the Middle East. Second objective, to see Southeast Asia regional policies to prevent religious radicalization. And this is actually the question given by colleagues in MEI for me to address this. I will try my best to address this part as well. And lastly, to look at the complexity of the Middle East impact on Islam in Southeast Asia. So I will try to tackle these three issues. So this is a map of the Middle East that we are talking about, we're referring to. And beyond these boundaries of nation states, there's of course complexities that are underneath them with deep historical ties with the Malay world. If you look at the demography, you can see, right, the different demographic shifts happening in the Middle East. And of course, certain states are more familiar to Southeast Asianists, particularly Saudi Arabia, because of religious reasons. And of course, Egypt also has long historical ties with Southeast Asianists because of educational reasons. So the ties of the Middle East and Southeast Asia are varied, and every single state that is found on this map, have different meanings, different stories for Southeast Asianists. So just a brief overview. I think my colleagues here in MEI are, of course, the experts on developments in the Middle East, but I'll just touch very briefly on my view on the Middle East. Of course, Middle East, as we know, remains the center of major religions in the world, and not only Islam. I think that's something that is common knowledge. But to underline the complexity of the Middle East, we often talk about the geopolitics of the Middle East, and then there's a lot of publications, a lot of books out there that talks about this rivalry between major powers, alliances, US role, but beneath them, there are also intra-Arab rivalries that we need to look at. But that's also very well known out there historically. But within the states itself, I mean, there are also class dynamics that's happening, and it's also shaping the politics of Middle East states. Yeah, I'm sure my colleagues here in the Middle East Institute would have examined all these issues and would be better in a better position to speak on these topics. We often have this imagination that authoritarian states are found in Middle East. But lately, if you look at the scholarship, we're also looking at civil society's role. I mean, this is not a recent phenomena if you look at the Middle East. But lately, particularly after the Arab Spring, we are seeing the role of civil society. I mentioned a few works here, Asaf Bayat looking at Iran, for instance, right? Looking at how civil society is playing a very crucial role in shaping the politics and society. So that's one area that's shaping Middle East. Of course, there are many other issues that we can talk about. What's shaping politics in the Middle East? So civil society is only one, but political succession is another dimension that we can talk about. But of course, this might have already been touched in the previous lectures. The other issue concerning the Middle East would be what next for petrodollars, particularly in a post-oil scenario for the Middle East, and how this will impact political Islam. I cited Hamid and McCann's edited volume and look at the different types of political Islam and the complexity. I think sometimes in Southeast Asia, we tend to use the term political Islam very loosely, but we have to look at the different dimensions of political Islam. And as Asaf Bayat mentioned in his book, are we looking at a post-Islamist society? So these are new debates that we are encountering within the academic circles. And lastly, the Middle East, particularly Gulf states, are also playing catching up. And how will this impact the Islamic identity? Mecca, of course, remains, when we talk about Islam, Mecca remains the center of Islam. But there are also other holy sites in Jordan, Egypt, Iran, Syria, Yemen, and Turkey. So apart from Mecca, now we've changed. So let's talk about the Southeast Asian dimension. Now we're changing class dynamics in Southeast Asia. The view of Islam towards Islam's role in the Middle East will also shift. Yes, Mecca will remain a destination for pilgrimage, but middle class in the Malay world are also looking at other sites, historical sites. Because of affluence, they can travel, and they are also looking for. And this will also shape the dynamics between Islam, and which also means exposure to other forms of Islamic thought and Islamic ideas. So that's another dimension. The other dimension, which is close to my heart, is the second point, looking at the role of Islamic education. I think if you're familiar with some of my recent works, myself, Dr. Azhar Ibrahim, Professor Nur Aisha Rahman, wrote a book about the Islamic studies graduates from Singapore and their learning journeys and experience in the Middle East. So we have published a book called Reaching for the Crescent. So this book looks at the impact of the Middle East universities on our students, and that's another dimension that's rarely talked about, the role of education, and whether there's a shift. If in the past it's always been Al-Azhar University, today are we still talking about Al-Azhar University or other alternative sources of education for Southeast Asians? Middle East soft power is another dimension that we want to look at. So in the past, it used to be petrodollars funding certain ideologies, certain ideas in Southeast Asia. But perhaps now we're not looking at those direct impact. How about soft power? We are looking at power in a softer way that's happening in global geopolitics. So could Middle East also be playing that role, and how it's impacting Muslim society here in Southeast Asia? And of course, last point I want to make about my brief overview of the Middle East is that Middle East also is undergoing change and evolution. Yes, of course, we can start from the Ottoman Caliphate, since the fall of the Ottoman Caliphate, and then also during the colonial period, post-war nationalism, Islam, and so on. And I cited Eric Traeger's book, The Arab Fall, as one good book that looks at Muslim Brotherhood, in particular in Egypt, and traces its evolution, its rise and fall. And of course, we can also replicate that study to other organizations in the Middle East and how it's impacting Southeast Asia. So judging from the last 3 slides alone, I think, I'm no Middle East expert, but I can sense the complexity before we even talk about its implications on Southeast Asian societies. So yeah, this is mini repetition of my earlier slide, looking at changing Middle East, post-oil Middle East and the Gulf states. How will this impact? So Middle East in the past, in the recent past, have always been seen as more conservative form of religious values versus secular and liberal ideas. So is this changing going forward due to the changes that's happening in the Middle East? And are we seeing a late comeback of globalization and westernization coming to the Middle East? Of course, I show the FIFA World Cup that's organized by the Qatar government. And you see how the success of that, and could it be, there could be late players in this, but are we seeing that shift that happened in the Malay world earlier, now replicated in the Middle East in the post-oil crisis? So let me begin by looking at some key takeaways of this presentation. Look at it historically. What I've cited earlier are recent developments in the Middle East and how it can impact Southeast Asia, but the Middle East impact in Southeast Asian Islam has been, for centuries, right? So some of the key takeaways that Middle East impact has always been neutral to Southeast Asia, but today the progressive views from the Middle East are marginal. So that's my first point, how it works. So Middle East should not get all the blame. So that's the long short of the story, right? So Middle East influence on Malay language and culture is not new. The Malay language will continue to evolve and the vocabulary will continue to expand. Arabization discourse needs more nuancing. So this, in a way, tries to address some of the concerns of our policymakers out here that Malays are now losing their cultural identity and moving towards Arabization. A lot of emphasis has been given to radicalism, particularly post-9/11, but sometimes we miss the elephant in the room, which is to look at how societies in Southeast Asia, if we really talk about Arabization, if this thing really exists, we should look at developments in Southeast Asia since the 1970s and 1980s. I think that is more crucial rather than looking at it as an Arabization discourse, because Southeast Asia, experienced this early wave of this Islamic revivalism, which has an impact on Muslim thinking, Muslim ideas to this very day. For those of you who watch the old P. Ramlee movies, a very famous Malay actor here. You can see a shift and changes in society, the way people dress, the way people behave, what are their demands, and what defines Islamic lifestyle. So you see that shift happening, and it happened in the 1970s and 1980s. Do I have a short point? Yeah, socio-historical context is very important when we talk about Middle East impact in Southeast Asia. Last point, last takeaway is that the theological approach is a dominant approach when we talk about Middle East impact. We always talk about religious issues, religion, ideas, jurisprudence. We always tend to think about that kind of impact. There is that impact, but we tend to forget that other factors that shape Southeast Asian responses to this Middle East impact, which includes class dynamics, right? How does the middle class behave in the Malay world vis-a-vis the underclass, and how do they respond differently to Southeast Asia, to Middle East impact, right? New media, this is another issue that we rarely talk about. How does the Middle East impact? Does the Middle East impact Malays here in Southeast Asia more in the past or currently? Now, given the new media age, or could it be somebody from the US who talks about Islam, which I think our middle class Malays, more educated Malays, associate with? So are we looking at a different dynamics at play here, looking at this new media impact? So alternative discourse. I will skip the slides very quickly. This basically shows an overview of the kinds of the whole past impact of Southeast Asian of the Middle East towards Southeast Asia. Majority of Muslims here are Sunnis. They are the Shafi'i schools of thought. One unique characteristics of Southeast Asian Islam is that it's very much tied to the royal courts, because Islam came to a feudal society, so very hierarchical. But there was, of course, impact of the early interactions of Middle East. Islam came to this region interface with a feudal society. But there was another wave which happened in the 18th and 19th century. Another impact of the Middle East, but this one of a more modernist, revivalist type. So you see, the different waves of impact shaping Southeast Asia is constantly changing. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in 1970s, Islamic revivalism came to this part of the world and introduced new brands of Islam. We're talking about Muslim Brotherhood. We're talking about the rise of Salafism, Wahhabism ideology, of course, in response to geopolitical tensions that's happening out there. Iranian Vilayat al-Faqih also became a discourse that shapes the Malay world, and global Sufism, particularly post 911. So this again shows the different waves and different levels of interaction that we see between Middle East and Southeast Asia. These few slides, I think I will skip, where it's just basically trying to tell you that different Malay societies, Indonesia, Malay Javanese societies, largely Muslim societies, and even within Southeast Asia itself, the different states that host a huge number of Muslims. There are, of course, diverse institutions, diverse orientations, and of course, this has got to come back to the way Islam was promoted, the way Islam came to this region, and of course, the policies adopted by the governments of the day. So Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, but generally not an Islamic state in the Iranian sense. So that's very interesting. Malaysia, also dominant Muslim nation, but different from Indonesia. It clearly states that Islam is the religion of the federation, and Islam in Indonesia is closely tied to the royal courts. So today, the Malay monarchs or the Malay rulers continue to become the heads of Islam and Malay culture. Singapore, a minority Muslim community, but in terms of its cultural practices and Islamic orientations, very close to what we see in Malaysia. Even though Malays and Muslims are minorities here, it's recognized as one of the religions, and there are institutions made available to look into the needs of Malay society through the administration of the Muslim Law Act. Recently, of course, I also considered Brunei into my analysis. Brunei is also quite interesting. It remains a monarchy, absolute monarchy, all rich country, Shafi'i school of thought, and it adopts the quite similar to Malaysia in a way, this role, this nexus, this connection between Melayu, Islam, dan Beraja. It means the role of the monarchy is very important in defining Islam. And recently, of course, they also adopted this Negara Zikir, the very Sufistic kind of discourses that shapes the kind of religious orientations the country is adopting. This slide basically is part of the reading list. So, like a good professor, we always sometimes we have no time to look at some of these areas. We just introduce some readings. So if you wish to look at how Islam came to this region, you may refer to Caesar Adib Mahul, Theories, Introduction and Expansion of Islam in Southeast Asia. Another important read that looks at the very early interactions between Southeast Asians and the Middle East, you may want to read Azumardi Azwa's book. Now you see, what I'm trying to show, even from the different books and literature itself, right? You see the different kinds of issues raised. Right? When you look at interactions between the Middle East and Southeast Asia. The earlier one looks at how Islam came to this region and how Islam, brought by the Hadramis in particular, interfaced with feudal society. And hence the kinds of questions is that, what's the role of mysticism? What's the role of Islamic laws during that point of time in the context of Victorian society? But you look at Azim Adi Azra's focus, if you move to the 17th and 18th century, you look at how Southeast Asian religious elites, personalities go to the Middle East to reform the society, different kinds. See, so the impact itself there are many different kinds of impact. It could be, some say, conservative impact, but Middle East could be a source of progressivism in particular periods and phase of society. So it's always evolving and changing. Yeah. So if you look at the interaction at that point of time, it's Islam, when it came to Southeast Asia, is generally neutral towards Malay culture. It respects Malay culture. And you can see that how Islam enriches the vocabulary of the Malay language. Of course, the interesting thing about Malay language is that it's continuously evolving. Right? It takes Sanskrit words, it takes Arabic words, and of course it enriches. And today it's still growing. It takes English words. So the vocabulary of the Malay language is still increasing. But just want to show that the impact of Islam in this part of the world enriches the Malay language. It enriches architecture thinking in terms of arts, in terms of what kinds of arts. So I think Islam's impact, the Middle East impact, interacted with local, and then it produces new original ideas, which is very interesting in terms of this level of interactions. Yeah. So floral design is a very key, element of Islam bring to the Southeast Asia, and the Malays added that form of color as well to many of these art forms, and it repackages into something that's very original. Again, coming back to my earlier point, now if people talk about Middle East as a source of conservatism, but in the past people go to the Middle East, to bring back modernist ideas. One of them is Syed Sheikh Al-Hadi, a thinker in the earlier 20th century, very much influenced by Sheikh Muhammad Abduh's thinking in Egypt, and bring back these ideas, trying to modernize society. So he published this book, very controversial book, recently reprinted. So this is the new cover, Agama Islam dan Akal, Islam and Rationalism. Another example is the founder of Muhammadiyah. For those of you who don't have time to read, you can watch this movie on Netflix, so it's available. Looking at how a figure from Yogyakarta did his pilgrimage, stayed for a while in modern day Saudi Arabia, come back bringing reforms. So Saudi Arabia was a source of reforms at that point of time. So challenges a more traditionalist kind of ulama. Sorry, I have to go through very fast because I think there's plenty to cover. Another interesting work that, to sum up, but this is written in Malay, that looks at the relationship between Islam and and Malay culture and culture in the general sense, is that Islam generally, when it came to this part of the world, is very neutral. It actually allows culture to flourish. It actually allows Malays to continue practicing Malay culture. Of course, it changes the monotheism part, the thinking part, the belief, but it generally respects Malay culture. And my point is this, we see a change in the 70s and 80s, where there is a group that suddenly comes in and say that we need to go back and be like the Middle East. This is another phase in this interaction between Middle East and the Malay world. This is what we call the revivalist phase. And trying to reconstruct Malay society to go back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So it's another phase of interactions between Middle East and Malay world. And here we go. We talk about the Middle East period. There are many factors that triggered this global wave of Islamic resurgence. Of course, due to geopolitical reasons, fall of Ottomans, the Arab-Israeli conflict, Soviet Union. This was during the Cold War period, Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan. But there was one particular episode, right, that happened in the Middle East that also somehow triggered that form of confidence amongst the Malays, the Malays in Muslims in this region, as well as the Muslims worldwide, about the need to return to Islam. One of it is, of course, Muslim Brotherhood, of course, more civil society kind of movement. The Iranian Revolution is so significant, even though it's a Shia kind of country. Malaysia are Sunnis, but at that point of time in 1979, there are many Malays who are interested to study the revolution. You know why? Because they feel that, oh, if this Ayatollah Khomeini, who's in his late 70s, 80s, can lead this revolution, there must be something that we can learn from Ayatollah Khomeini. And hence, you see, this impacted Malay society. It impacted Malay political parties in Malaysia, for instance. So they're beginning to reorientate themselves. Kepimpinan ulama, for instance, the leadership of the ulama. Where did this come from? With ayat ifaqih. So okay, he's Shia, but the political revolution we must study. We must adopt, and we can soon make it Sunni. So the Middle East changed, and hence during this period, there was a growing group of people said we need to go back to Islam, but they do not differentiate Islam with Middle East, and hence this was the phase where there's a change in terms of the identity of the Malays back then. This is an example. This is the famous Darul Al-Arqam movement in 1980s, and we people dress, the kinds of ideas being promoted as the Islamic alternative to the secular governments of the day. Somehow there was this contestation between the two groups, and look at the way they try to adopt the dressing, and then they're trying to say that this is the alternative Islamic way, but it's borrowing from the Middle East, right? The niqab, for instance, is something foreign to the Malay world. In fact, the hijab at one point of time was very foreign to the Malay world, right? But these changes happened in the 70s and the 80s. I'll go through very quickly, right, to the more contemporary in the last 10 minutes or so. So when we talk about the Middle East impact today, we must be very careful, Of course, in the past, we see different phases have different impact. But if we talk about the Middle East today, we have to ask this question: which Middle East country, which ideology, which organization? You see, is it Salafi Wahhabism? Is it Muslim Brotherhood? Is it Wilayah Ifaqih? Is it Neo-Sufism? Second point, we also need to look at the local actors, and how they respond. See? So this is a variety of interactions that we are looking at here. Third point, the significance of Islamic education in the Middle East. But now we're looking at social media and online influences. How is this changing society? And last point, changing political social landscape in the Middle East. So in the past, the fear is that, you go to Saudi Arabia, you come back with a different kind of orientation. Let me be blunt that, people worry that, become Salafis and Wahhabis, But is that the case today? With these new developments that's happening in the Middle East, right? So the role of the ulama versus intellectuals are also changing, not only within the Middle East. There's always this contestation, but sometimes because of globalization, because of the new media space, intellectuals who may not have a place in the Middle East have now moved to the West. I think I will elaborate some of this later. And they begin this engagements across the globe, and it's played out in front of the global audience. So who are you to decide that this is one particular impact and one particular discourse that's affecting the Malay world? Let me just go through quickly some of the concerns and impact. Right, of course, to address the question of radicalism. I'm sure we all know that after 9/11, Southeast Asia also became the hotbed of radical ideas. So Al-Qaeda became a major organization that's under the spotlight in the global war on terror. But in Southeast Asia, two particular organizations, the Jama'ah Islamiyah is one of the biggest and impactful, responsible for many of the terrorist attacks. Bali bombing, for instance, in 2002. And a more recent case would be the ISIS threat the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, which has also impacted how states in Southeast Asia dealt with this. There's a lot of factors that shape the rise of terrorism. So Middle East, of course, played a role in terms of where it triggered, but some of these battles were really brought to Southeast Asia, and the Southeast Asian governments had to tackle it. So it's international, transnational versus the local kinds of engagements. So these are some of the headlines that we saw and how governments tackle it. I must say that to sum up, right, governments tackle it in two ways, right? And it cannot be one way. One, of course, is to use hard power through laws. So Singapore used the Internal Security Act, but I wanted to highlight more on the soft power approaches, right? Where this is, of course, the Singapore's context, where I think there's an engagement. It's quite unique, this. And when I visited the Middle East recently, of course, there are also new initiatives that tries to also look at tackling radicalism in this way as well, using soft power, using engagements, interreligious dialogues. And interestingly, if you talk about the Middle East impact, if any, on this, is that the tariqah or the Sufi circles become very active in promoting this kind of moderate Islam. And we see Sufi leaders coming forefront, to become the spokesperson for a moderate voice of Islam. And in Singapore, of course, there are many other initiatives, like this whole discourse of moderation in Islam and the creation of the Singapore Muslim identity to oppose, right, radical ideas. But what's interesting, why Sufi groups and why tariqah groups? Who is the opponent of the Sufi groups? Mainly the Salafis. The Salafis and the Wahhabis, right? They're seen as the opponent of the Sufi groups. And hence, there is this whole debate, that actually Wahhabism and Salafism created that ideological platform for terrorism and radicalism. And hence, to oppose it, we need the softer, and then it's Salafism and it's Sufism and tariqah groups. Of course, we can discuss this a bit more, but that was the thinking behind the emergence of these Sufi groups. I mentioned this earlier, looking at the role of how Islamic parties. So earlier we talked about the impact of Middle East and radicalism. There are also other impacts such as politics, how politics changed in the 1980s, right? And political parties began championing for laws that are seen as Islamic and Sharia. Actually, I was reading very interestingly last night, right? Actually, in the Middle East too, during the same period, right? There were also this push for greater Sharia, greater Islamization in the aspect of legal and even educational institutions. So it was quite parallel at that point of time. So again, I haven't had the chance to go deeper into that, but it was the same period, the 80s, and this is already happening in the Malay world. But not all of this evolution of political parties, changed because of the Middle East. So if you go to Indonesia, most of these parties emerged due to local issues, particularly the democratization in Indonesia led to the springing of new parties. And not all of these are very much Middle East influencing. Some of these organizations, if you compare Hizbut Tahrir movement, which was banned in 2017 in Indonesia, became part of this larger picture, inspired by what happens in the Middle East, was of course banned. But there are others that are that spring up because of the democratization that's ongoing in Indonesia, for instance. So there's this combination of Middle East, but we should not discount, right, the influence of the local factors as well. Some of this, another impact that I wish to look at was, of course, the impact of education, right? Sometimes we look at how there are two ways of Middle East impact in education. One is curriculum. So a lot of the Islamic studies try to refashion itself to Middle Eastern universities. So that's one way. Another impact that's generally overlooked is the formation of different organizations and campus movements. There's this interesting work by Dr. Yon Mahmoudi, who had a chapter in one of my edited volumes, Islam in Southeast Asia, that looks at the different groups competing amongst themselves in Indonesian campuses. The Shia movements, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizbut Tahrir, Salafi movement, and Hizmet movement, all competing and have their own patrons and followers in campuses. So that's another interesting dynamic. Lifestyle also witnessed significant changes. I think I've mentioned this earlier. We watch P. Ramlee movies and you compare society today. It's a very different society. To what extent are all this impacted by the Middle East, or could it be impacted by changes in income? Muslims began to show outwardly their piety. So Chandra Muzaffar in his book talked about the castika Islam. You know, there was this period where people tried to show their piety by pasting all this interesting Quranic verses to show that they are pious Muslims. So this happened in the 70s and 80s. But today we look at the impact of the Middle East, if any. You look at the changing lifestyles, you know, what is pure Islam, what is tainted Islam. I think there are concerns about Malays now dressing Arabic, practicing Arabic culture, using Arabic words. So is this a cause of concern? Right, but this is a changing lifestyle that we are witnessing in Southeast Asia. This map basically shows the travel patterns of Muslims around the world. It shows the changing nature of the middle class. And look, Middle East remains a very important destination for many Malays, and in fact, Muslims globally. And the next group of place, you know, that is popular amongst Muslim travelers is actually Southeast Asia. Okay, so Middle East and Southeast Asia are popular destinations for Muslim travelers. All right, just very quickly, just as a form of conclusion, just to confuse matters a little bit, when we talk about Middle East impact, sometimes right now we tend to think of conservatism, right? Conservatism impact and how people are using Malay culture. There are many Middle East influences that are also still promoting progressive views. One particular person I wish to highlight is Habib Hassan Alatas, right? The Imam of Masjid Alawi, famous for promoting interfaith work. There is also a culture of translation of some of Middle Eastern works into Southeast Asia. So in Indonesia is very strong. In particular, some of the works that you think would form as a very progressive Muslim type of Middle Eastern thinkers are being translated. Hassan Hanafi, Muhammad Shaltut, Al-Jamiri. So there are groups that are actually looking to the Middle East for progressive views. But, you know, the Middle East itself is undergoing change, right? And there's this ideological competition right now that we're seeing between Saudi Arabia and UAE versus Qatar. So if we talk about this particular book, right, David Warren, right, he looks at the different rivals in the Gulf. This is Al-Qaradawi brand of Islam versus the Bin Bayah brand of Islam today, which is quite interesting dynamics. And you know that Yusuf Qaradawi has passed on, and whether Bin Bayah is now being seen as a very important spiritual figure for Southeast Asia. So this is you can expect this quote, of course, but this is Yusuf Qaradawi. He passed on. At one point of time, I remember writing this article in the New Mandala, you know, who is actually influencing Malaysian elections, because a lot of Malaysian politicians at that point of time look up to Qaradawi as a source of, you know, spiritual guidance. You know? I think this source is a global mufti kind of idea. But since he has passed on, it seems that he's been overtaken by Bin Bayah. So this is an example of, I took this from his website. This is the vice president of Indonesia meeting Bin Bayah. And he was named as Tokoh Mal Hijrah in Malaysia. So again, you see changing times, how earlier we talked about rivals in the Gulf, but today see how Malay society is also switching, right, and responding differently to the soft power. It's an award. It's an award to acknowledge a key Muslim personality. Nobody is locally, but Bin Bayah is a foreigner to get it. Yeah, I think changing Middle East is, I think, just to reiterate some points. I mean, I've been to Mecca a few times. in the last 20 years. In fact, I was there for the first time in 2003 for religious reasons. And I saw the change. In that point of time, we don't even have internet access. It's very difficult to do work at that point of time. You can't. I remember, walking at the Grand Mosque. They're very reluctant if you take photos of important sites or even take videos. But today, so societies have changed. And interestingly, I've been there recently, as recent as last November. In the past, when you pass the customs and immigration, it's only males, right? But today you see the immigration counters, all men by females. So you see this change happening in the Middle East. And of course, it will change more. Of course, concerts in Saudi Arabia, Qatar World Cup, and these are some of the issues of changes that we need to grapple with. And this basically sums up the kinds of change and how the religious establishment in the Middle East will respond to this will also have an impact in Southeast Asia. Yeah, I will end with this point. We talk about Middle East impact. We're not only talking about focusing on people living in the Middle East, but because of movement, travels, there's this contestations for a long time between the ulama class and the intellectuals. I recently read this books in fact, by Khalid Abu Fadil, very well-known scholar on Islamic law, basically. Very, very critical, very, very critical of developments. And in fact, these sermons are of course available online, but this was republished as books. It just shows you, right, the kinds of dynamics and changes that's happening. And people in Southeast Asia are also reading these books. So on the one hand, we have people like Bin Baya and Hamza Yusuf. But on the other hand, we also have groups, that are closely following thinkers, the so-called progressive thinkers, right, from the Middle East. And all this are played out. And how will this impact Southeast Asia? So the topics are inequality, gender rights, and legal reforms, for instance, are being mentioned in this sermons, right? Which just shows that the complexity of this relationship between Middle East and Southeast Asian Islam. Right, so just to sum up, conclusion, I mentioned 6 points here. I think we need to rethink this whole Arabization discourse as the main cause of conservatism. We also need to look at the local factors. We need to understand the socio-historical processes in Southeast Asia, the external and the local. If we're looking at the Malay world, we need to understand the revivalism, Islamic revivalism that happened in the 70s and 80s and how it shapes the orientation. Fourth point, terrorism is a concern. And I hope I've responded to the request to look at how people have handled this here. But there are also non-violent aspects of political Islam that's rarely looked on. Another area of concern is, of course, religious education in the Middle East. But that is also changing. But what about the role of social media, and people's access? People can choose now, which Middle East scholars, or maybe they don't even need Middle East scholars, to guide them on Islamic matters. Especially when English is now used as the language to study religion. It's also changing, in the Malay world. It used to be Malay, right? They study religion using Malay, but now they study English. And hence access to Hamza Yusuf, Mufti Menk, So these are the figures, that are shaping the religious life. And progressives have more space in Indonesia. You look at Indonesia, it's more vibrant in terms of translation culture, and most of these progressive thinkers from the Middle East works have been. But Malaysia and Singapore, I think the space of this translation and engagement is still limited when compared to Indonesia. But I think it will change, right? Given, again, the use of social media to understand religious discourses. Sorry to just go a bit over time, but I hope I've covered what is expected, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Norshel, for a very insightful presentation and enlightening us on the social, Islamic and cultural and political interactions between Southeast Asia and the Middle East. and showing us how complex the relationship between the two is. Now, I will open the floor for the questions, but I will take the privilege as a moderator to ask you a question. So you highlighted on the influence of the Middle East in Southeast Asia, life, not only the religious practice, but also the lifestyle, and as well as the cultural and the art. In your new book, the title is Trending Islam Cases from Southeast Asia. I wonder if you can give us an insight on what are those trending Islamic ideas in Southeast Asia. And I am really curious to see where did they come from and whether the modernization in the Middle East have played a role.
Sounds like a book talk now. So I'm happy to take that question because again, I think it's in line with what I've discussed. We look at trending Islam. Basically, it's part of a project which I did at my institute. Look at trendsetters of Islam in Southeast Asia. We try to highlight some of the key figures, key personalities that shape Southeast Asian Islam, mainly in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. So when we look at trends, we tend to focus on personalities. That's one. Personalities or organizations, right? And if you look at, over the years, which organizations, it could be institutions, state-formed institutions, or, people are beginning to question whether state-formed institutions continue to influence people's thinking, given that, there are alternative organizations that also touch on Islamic. So trends could be divided into three aspects. One is who are the players? It could be individuals or organizations. Secondly, it could be the medium. What is a trending medium? My concern is that people are no longer looking at the religious ideas per se. People are looking at how ideas are being transmitted. A very, very communication studies kind of approach, where the medium is the message, People are more excited if an ulama goes on TikTok, for instance. That's to them, wow, the real ulama. So it could be the most conservative ideas being promoted, but as long as it's on TikTok, it's modern. so that's. And the last trend, which I think is the most important trend, which I invite readers, and particularly Muslims who read it, to evaluate ideas. Trends could be in the form of discourse. I think there must be the power to evaluate ideas, how it impacts society. People sometimes, given the structures and his historical Islamization that happened in this world, tend to think unquestioningly, this have this very blurred divide, Salafism versus Sufism, progressive liberals versus conservative. I actually invite readers to look at the discourse per se and how it impacts Southeast Asian societies, because sometimes, it's not as easy as conservative equals to Salafis and Sufis equals to moderates and progressives, because if you look deeper at the impact of some ideas promoted by groups seen as progressive, if you look at the context in Southeast Asia, it also may have negative consequences. So yeah, that's the sum up of the why we compile this. So there's a range of topics, mainly on the medium, the use of social media, but also to look at lifestyle trends, and also to look at the traditional issues that considered trends, like issues pertaining to radicalism. And we look at specific countries in Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much. Another question that I have also from my side. So you've mentioned the influence of the social media and also the students and the scholars who visit the Middle East, as well as the tourists who go to the Middle East. But one thing that we didn't talk about is the charity networks that exist in Southeast Asia. does those charity networks play a role in influencing Islam in the Southeast Asia? And has the modernization of Islam in Saudi Arabia from Wahhabism to modern Islam?
Sorry, I didn't catch the word charity. You're talking about charities.
Charity
Okay.
network, yeah. Yeah, and then, yeah. And do those charity promote certain sects of ideology of Islam and Southeast Asia?
I mean, the charities, we have to go back to, I mentioned it briefly. I mean, petrodollars, there's an era. Of course, you must understand the geopolitical factors that shaped and triggered that. But not only geopolitics, talking about during the Cold War period, US versus USSR, but we're talking about the Arab ideological rivalry as well, right? Between the Sunni world and the Shia. That's one dichotomy. Today, if we talk about the Middle East, there is the Muslim Brotherhood versus the non-Muslim Brotherhood kind of dichotomy as well, right? That's the so-called Indo-Arab geopolitical rivalry, for the lack of a better term. And charity should be understood on those aspects. Because as I mentioned earlier, the Iranian Revolution, in terms of the ideas, right, it gels well with the locals here in Southeast Asia, wanting to learn and reform society and looking at a model. And they look at the political dimension of wilayah-e-faqih. And at that point of time, of course, there was a period where Gulf states and with petrodollars and trying to, of course, counterbalance in the fear that Southeast Asia may turn Shia, and hence promoting this kind of charities in this part of the world. So I think if I get your question correctly, I think. Is charity devoid of ideology? Well, I would think that charity is charity, but ideology could be direct or indirect in terms of its influence.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I see that I'm having questions from Zoom, but I want to also open the floor for the people in the room if you have any questions before we take the Zoom questions.
Hi, my name is Fahima. One thing I see that you used the term like neutral Islam when it was in Southeast Asia. I don't know if I got it right, but the term neutral Islam when it was in Southeast Asia. So I want a clarification also, what is neutral Islam and therefore then what is the Islam you would call in Middle East one? Second is really on the influence, I think the aspects of what's happening in the new Middle East with the whole, normalization with Israel, because pan-Islamism was one factor connecting Muslim communities from Arab countries to, Southeast Asia on, the outlook or the policies towards Israel. So now that is shifting, do you think that the same pan-Islamism concept would, run across Muslim communities in Southeast Asia like it is happening in the Arab world? So,
a question of a neutral Islam. When I first use it, I'm mainly responding to this whole idea of Arabization. Arabization that's happening. And the relationship is always that Arabic culture is here to subsume Malay culture and those things. But the use of the term neutral Islam is going back to the very philosophy of religion, which says that Islam is neutral to culture, right? There's no, and the Malays in the past understood it. The Malay ulamas in the past, they understood it. Right, and hence they are promoting their culture. And Malay culture, despite Islamization, withstood all this. To the extent, there was another wave of so-called the Padri Wars. I think the term is quite strange, Padri Wars, but it's referring to the purification. It's similar to the Wahhabi movement that happened to the Malay world early on. I would say late 18th century or early 19th century. Despite all this cleansing and purification, many aspects of Malay culture were left untouched. Which just shows that the ulama in the past understood the very philosophy of Islam is actually neutral to culture. It was only in the 80s, and this is where I want to differentiate neutral Islam with that revivalist kind of Islam that tries to think that actually it's not. You have to go back to Islam, but in the Arabic form. they study Islam in a form, but the substance. So that's to respond to your first question. Normalization of Israel, how will it pan out? Again, it's pretty early to see how this will pan out. Of course, you as you correctly mentioned about this whole idea of pan-Islamism that triggered. Of course, it started off with the earlier point which I made about the fall of the Ottoman Caliphate. How he created, and what next model after the Caliphate. So they created this form of nationalism and trying to create a new model. Let me just share the reality here today. Is that despite all these announcements that are being made, we do not, in Southeast Asia, we do not see any major reactions, right? Apart from some leaders that try to create some form of dialogue. So we have the OIC, this one, but some leaders, and this was of course during the time of Dr. Mahathir when he was a second-time prime minister, he tried to create another platform, trying to bring in the Islamic world together. And of course he met, trying to get Turkey on board, Pakistan on board, and other Gulf states, but of course it didn't really take off at that point of time. But that's the only thing that happened, But talking about the more recent normalization of relations, we don't see any movement at all in Southeast Asia. We don't hear any protests. Normally, in Malaysia, Indonesia, of course, there might be small-scale protests, but large-scale protests we don't hear, which is, I think, just to respond to that, the reality is that we're not seeing any signs of that from the ground and from the leadership.
Another question? So from Asif.
Thank you so much for your presentation. One thing about the portion where you have mentioned that the radicalism or the Islam that has come to Southeast Asia in a similar fashion, the reform is not coming. I think that's kind of a very grim portion. The reform that's happening in the Middle East is not coming in the same proportion.
Yeah.
And this is where you said that not all blames has to be put on the Middle East, I think it's a kind of a grim situation. Taking cue from that particular portion, I wanted to ask you, have you looked at this thing that when Islam started coloring the geography or the population, it is irreversible, right? People of different religion, religious domination, were living all across the globe. When Islam spread, wherever it spread, it was irreversible. Like it didn't go into the previous state. Now, similarly, one can say that a portion of radicalism or extremism that was attached to that Islam, wherever it went, in a similar fashion, that is also sort of irreversible, right? I just wanted to, or you to, introspect or maybe give it some thought. What is this process? Is it really so as I'm thinking, or is something different? Because
if I get your question correctly, I think first and foremost, we need to differentiate between the Islam and the Islamic orientations. I think that's fundamental. So when you said that Islam came and it's irreversible, yes, when it came to Southeast Asia, we see the growing numbers of Muslims here, and it of course became a very important site of Islam, and it also, of course, Indonesia is the most populous country in the world. So in a way, we don't see a reversal of that trend. Though, if you ask me, Southeast Asian Islam remains in the margins of the greater global discourse of Islam, right? Within the Islamic world, right? For instance, Indonesia is not treated as as an equal, when it comes to Islamic discourses. So right now we're seeing more initiatives undertaken by the Indonesian civil society, even Indonesian state, trying to promote an Indonesian brand of Islam through Islamic moderation. So that's one. The other aspect is the orientations differ. Even though we don't see the reversal of this Islam, but orientations, different groups with different ideas, again, coming back to different influences from the Middle East and other parts of the world, and the interaction of local factors, colors Islam everywhere in the world. And this is more fluid, if you ask me. Ideas can change quickly, though though some would retain, some could be conservative, some could be more progressive, some could be more open, depending on where they live, depending on where they originate. This is more fluid, and it could see reverse, or it could see changing patterns. On your point about radical Islam, and that's a very interesting point, if you ask me. Are we talking about perceptions of people, associating Islam with radicalism? And that's a major point. And we have to study, the impact of Orientalism, for instance, and this dominant perception about Islam, and it's unchanging and static. Whereas if you look at the different dimensions of it, in terms of, if you distinguish Islam and orientations, you can see that there are different ways Muslims behave. But unfortunately, because of what happened recently, this association is there, and this one is very difficult to reverse. But on that note, it doesn't mean that we, as Muslims, right, we are denying that there is no problem. Of course, radicalism exists, though if you ask me, it's a minority, but this minority group could create a major impact because it's dealing with violence. Yeah. But on another dimension, this is where I think we rarely looked at, is the non-violent type of extremism. That sometimes, we talk about migrant societies, this is a huge concern. This happens in Europe, this happens in countries like Western countries like the US and Australia, for instance, where there are migrants, Muslim migrants. Sometimes, it's the adjustments that is difficult, and for both sides to understand each other. This probably would have created tension. But if you go down to another level of looking at non-violent type of extremism, how do we respond to changing circumstances of host countries? Sometimes we need to understand the thinking and worldview. So this dimension, I feel, is something that is work in progress for many Muslims.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions from the floor? Okay, so I do have a question. We spoke about how the Islamic practice has changed in Southeast Asia in 1970s, especially when it comes to the hijab and the niqab. But again, now we are seeing changes in the Middle East. The incident of Mahsa Amini, it's been 1 year since that incident, and then we saw protests in Iran against the hijab. Now Saudi Arabia is also eliminating restrictions on women. The hijab is not obligatory anymore. So how receptive the Muslims in Southeast Asia to those kind of changes, especially when it comes to hijab? And then if you also have an idea which countries are more receptive than others?
I wouldn't look at it in terms of countries. I would prefer to look at it in terms of class dynamics and behaviors. Those are very interesting points, that we always see things in a cycle, the rise of the use of hijab, and now people are questioning it, But we definitely see a growing number. On the one hand, I think we should respect a person's view about hijab. If a person feel that it's important to their religious identity and feel that it's Islamic, then I think we should respect that. Vice versa. But I think it's most important is to look at the historical trends, that this will continue to evolve and change. And we are living in a particular era where I think there's this particular view about hijab, but we must also look back in different phases of our ancestors' life, that maybe there are different views about this, and we need to be respectful about this. It's not only about theology. The debate about hijab doesn't only center around theology. I think we have to look at many dynamics: politics, whether there's a law that asks you to do it, that requires to do it, the political dimension, the social dimension, what kinds of religious elites you have, what kinds of ulama do you have, where are they trained, family factors, psychological factors. So I just want to share, this hijab topic can go on for 3 lectures. First and foremost, there is this trend in Southeast Asia that talks about hijrah. You know what's hijrah? I think people know about hijrah. It's the migration of the Prophet from Mecca to Medina. I think we all know about this. It's because of political reasons, political persecution, and the need to find a new place. But of course, there's another dimension of hijrah which people are talking about is the spiritual dimension. The movement of people, the movement of spirit to the betterment, or purification of the heart. So now we're talking about this kind of hijrah. And interestingly, while people think that it's a very good concept, I have nothing against that, Yeah, I mean, we have that committed sins in the past. We want to hijrah to the better life. Very good concept. But now, the concept of hijrah, this is mainly among celebrities that we often see. Concept of hijrah is now tied to hijab. The moment somebody puts on the hijab, I have performed hijrah. It's no longer talking about the spiritual dimension of it, It's identifying a certain symbol to it. Now, that's a very interesting. I don't have comments about it, but it's a very interesting trend. So that's one story about hijab. Another dimension I want to comment, is beyond which countries, as I mentioned. It's about lifestyle too. The purpose of hijab is, what's the purpose of hijab? People rarely debate about this. Today, in the Malay world, people are talking about hijab as I don't know, what's the right term? High-end kind of good, We buy expensive hijabs, hundreds of dollars kinds of hijab, So, people never question that dimension. It's become something fashionable. It's become, a good, a commodity. And people never evaluate and re-evaluate that against the very principles of Islam. Never, of social good, of, not wasting resources, But you see class dynamics at play here. So hijab has taken the discourse to a new level, if you ask me. So the debate about hijab is not about theology. It will continuously be changing, but there are also other dimensions that we need to look at.
Well, thank you very much. So there is another question. It is on the education. So has the as you rightly mentioned, the Islam is not practiced in a homogeneous way in the different Middle East countries. Actually, we shouldn't look at the Middle East country as one.
Yeah.
Different countries, different practices of Islam. And now we are seeing the modernization that is taking place in different Middle East countries. So has this modernization influenced the destinations for students who wants to go and study Islam in the Middle East?
Quite a big question, modernization. Let me talk about the Malay world first, because I remember one of the first modules I took as an NUS student, a good NUS student in 20 years ago, was about modernization and the Malays. There was this very interesting lecture. What is modernization of the Malays? Because there is a group of Malay elites at that point of time that's equating modernization to westernization. The moment you behave like a West, dress like a West, be capitalist, good in business, you're modernized. Whereas if you study modernization in terms of its alternative definition, again, we compare it to the Japanese experience, for instance, of modernization. It's about modernization of thought towards rationalism. So there was this big debate. Now, when you ask about modernization in the Middle East, it triggers this first lecture that I had 30 years ago. And hence, in one of my slides, if you notice, I mentioned about, is Middle East experiencing the late globalization and westernization? Because what we are seeing in the Middle East today is that you use the term modernization, but we are equating it to westernization. Has there been serious thought on reforming the thinking of doing things? Has it changed? Or are we just imposing on the surface Western culture, having concerts, having World Cup, and said that we are modernized with modern technology? Is that modernization? How about the thinking behind it, the innovation, the freedom to think, to have a proper debate and dialogue. And these are some of the issues, the measurements of modernization that I don't know. It's still developing. If you ask, but how I answer your question? The second part of the question is, of course, how do we witness this? How do we respond to this, especially in terms of education? This is very interesting. It can go 2 lectures. This is from a recent book. There's this talk now. I've been to Al-Azhar University because of the research. Honestly, very backward in terms of facilities, lecture theatres, probably 80s, 90s. Nothing has changed, traditional way. And hence they compare with more modern universities in the Middle East. We shouldn't go to Al-Azhar University because there are many other universities in the Middle East that offers NUS facilities, NUS type facilities, modern lecture theatres, converse in English, good Wi-Fi, that kind of thing. And hence I did this comparison and evaluation. What does this mean to, again, coming back to the idea of modernization, what does this mean to the quality of education and quality of thought and quality of discourse? I'm not saying that Al-Azhar promotes that, intellectualism, of dialogue and discourses of the what's happened, already developed in the West. But, we should not deny Al-Azhar's role, in educating religious elites on religious sciences, because that's its particular role. But to associate another modern university because of its modern facilities, but not evaluating the thinking, I think that's very wrong. Because if you look at it, it's the same mode of thinking, but only expressed in modern forms or contemporary technology. So how do the Malays respond to that? They prefer to go to this because they look at the surface, and say that this is more modern compared to Al-Azhar. But if you look at it comparatively, there's no significant change, no significant differences.
Okay, great, thank you very much. Any further questions from the room? And okay, so we don't have more questions. So with that, I think it's time to close this session. Thank you very much, Dr. Norshel, for a very insightful presentation and also for your generosity to respond to the questions.
Thank you.
And I can see that your book is here.
Yes, I brought my book here.
Yeah, so if anyone is interested, so you can, I don't know.
You can purchase it. I think it's in major bookstores. You can come to my institute to purchase those books.
Okay, amazing. So with that, I close the session today, and I invite you all to join us next week for the wrap-up sessions, where we close the ME101 lecture series. Please join us, and you will learn more on how all of this development has implications to Singapore. With that, thank you very much again, and have a nice evening.